I'm going to tell you about a pattern I saw in every so-called genius I ever met, and how I stumbled on it the hard way by doing physics and breaking safes. I was there at Princeton, at Los Alamos, later at Caltech, working with people like Bethe and von Neumann and Dirac. Everybody else was saying, "Oh, these guys are geniuses, it's magic." But I was in the same rooms, chewing on the same problems, and I could watch exactly what they were doing with their minds. After a while I realized something. It wasn't magic, it was a habit. Actually, 4 habits, all wrapped into one loop. I didn't call it a pattern of genius back then. I was just trying not to be stupid. But looking back, I can see that every really good idea I had came from running those 4 patterns over and over like a machine. The thing is, nobody ever sat me down and said, "Richard, here are the 4 sacred rules of thinking like a genius." That's bullshit. What actually happened is I was a curious kid who liked to fiddle with radios, and later I found myself surrounded by people everybody said were smarter than anybody else alive, and I'm watching, I'm listening. I'm trying to see what they times do asterisk, not what they times say times they do. The way a locksmith listens to the clicks in a lock, I started listening to the clicks inside their heads. After years of that, and screwing up plenty on my own, I finally figured out there's a hidden pattern in all this genius thinking. It isn't about remembering more formulas or knowing more fancy words. It's 4 simple moves, repeated. You can train your brain to do them. I know because that's exactly what I did, without knowing it. I'll tell you the first time I noticed it, even though I didn't have a name for it. I was maybe 12, fixing radios for the guys in the neighborhood during the Depression. These were cheap sets, always breaking, and the owners didn't know a resistor from a donut. I didn't know much either, but I did one thing they didn't. I looked at the times thing itself, asterisk. I didn't start with the instruction manual, because half the time they'd already lost it. I'd stare at the tubes and the wires and think, what is this times supposed times to do? Where could it go wrong? I'd turn the knobs, listen to the hum, wiggle a tube, bang the side. It was like the radio was talking to me. Not in some mystical way, it just had behavior. And if I watched closely enough, it would tell me what was screwed up. Years later, I realized that was the first pattern. Look at reality, not at the words about reality. Every genius I ever met did that. They didn't trust definitions, they trusted the thing. At Princeton, the mathematicians were always talking very fancy, but when von Neumann walked in, he'd say something like, "Well, what happens if you just plug in the numbers?" He wanted to times see times how it behaved. At Los Alamos, the guys who understood the reactor best were the ones who went down and watched the damn thing, not the ones who only read the reports. So the first pattern is, go to the concrete. What is actually happening? Don't be hypnotized by symbols or prestige or big words. If you want to train your brain for that, you practice asking, every time you hear something impressive, what does that really times mean times in the world? If you can't see it, you don't understand it. At Los Alamos, this got me into trouble and into fun at the same time. They had these big government safes with combination locks, full of secret papers about how to blow up the world. Everybody walked around times impressed times by the security, top secret, and all that jazz. I didn't care about the label, I was curious about the lock. You see, the lock is just a physical device. Someone designed it. It has weaknesses. So instead of thinking, oh, this is secure because the army says so, I thought, how does this thing actually work? I'd listen to the clicks, feel the tumblers, look at how people chose their numbers. I learned that most guys used the last digits of the factory default, or some easy pattern. Pretty soon I was opening safes all over the place, not to steal anything, just to show them their wonderful system wasn't working the way they imagined. Now, here's the interesting part. To the colonel, the security was the Times word asterisk, classified, stamped on the folder, and the heavy door with the combination. To me, the security was, how hard is it for a guy like me to actually open this thing? Same lock, 2 different realities. The geniuses I knew always looked for the second one. That brings me to the second pattern. They played times with the problem. They didn't just try to solve it the proper way. They fiddled, they poked, they tried crazy things. When I was cracking those safes, I'd try all sorts of nonsense. Birthdays, obvious sequences, spinning the dial fast, slow, listening for any difference. Half the fun was mucking around. That same playful messing around is how I got into serious physics too. If an equation looked ugly, I'd flip it upside down, take extreme cases, change the units, anything to see how it behaved when you poked it. If you want a good example of that, there's the spinning plate story. I was at Cornell after the war, depressed, thinking I'd never do any good physics again. I was supposed to be working on serious problems, but I just didn't feel like it. One day in the cafeteria, I look up and I see this guy toss a plate in the air. The red Cornell emblem is wobbling around faster than the plate is spinning. Now, a sensible, respectable physicist ignores that and goes back to his important work. I wasn't feeling very respectable. So I thought, how the hell does that plate move? I started scribbling equations just for fun to see if I could relate the wobble to the spin. No application, no payoff, just play. Fooling with that stupid plate led me back into quantum electrodynamics. The equations I wrote for fun turned into a new way of thinking about how particles interact. So the second pattern is, treat problems like toys. Twist them, exaggerate them, try the wrong way on purpose, see what breaks. The guys we call geniuses did that all the time. Dirac would write down these strange, beautiful equations that didn't obviously apply to anything yet, just because the math looked elegant. Beth at Los Alamos would make crazy approximations, back-of-the-envelope stuff, to get a feel for the reactor before the fancy calculations were ready. You train your brain for that by giving yourself permission to mess around. Take an idea you learned in school, say, Newton's law of gravity. What if the force fell off as 1 over the times cubed times of the distance instead of the square? What would planetary orbits look like? You don't need a purpose. Just play. Eventually, your brain learns that the world gives up its secrets faster when you're willing to poke it from odd angles. Now, if all you do is look at reality and play with it, you get somewhere, but you don't get far enough. The third pattern I saw in all these characters was that they could switch how they saw a problem, like changing lenses on a camera. They never got stuck in one representation. When I was working on quantum electrodynamics, the usual way was this heavy operator formalism, lots of abstract symbols marching across the page. I could follow it, but I couldn't times C times it. It made me feel stupid. So I asked myself, is there another way to picture what's going on? That's how I ended up with those crazy little squiggly things you now call Feynman diagrams. To me, they were just doodles that let me visualize particles exchanging photons like little balls being thrown back and forth. Same physics, different picture. Suddenly, the calculations became almost obvious. Every genius I watched did some version of that. Dirac had his own special symbols for quantum mechanics, those bracket things, because they made the structure clearer to times him asterisk. Von Neumann could flip a problem in his head from geometry to algebra to logic and back while you were still writing down the first equation. They weren't married to one language. You see, the world doesn't care which notation you like. Nature is doing what it's doing. Our job is to find any representation that makes the pattern pop out. So the third pattern is change the picture. If you usually think in words, draw a diagram. If you usually think with equations, make a cartoon. If you're stuck on a problem, ask, can I express this in a completely different way? You can train that by deliberately translating things. Explain electricity as water flow, or probability as area, or thermodynamics as a story about people trading marbles. That brings me to the fourth pattern, and this one is the sneakiest, intellectual honesty, pushed to the point of humiliation. Every really sharp guy I knew had some version of this. They were willing to look themselves in the mirror and say, I don't understand this, even when everyone else was nodding along pretending they did. When I came to Caltech and started giving those big freshman lectures, I tried to explain basic physics as simply as I could. Many times I'd get halfway through and realize, wait a minute, I myself don't really know why it's like that. So I'd go back to my office and bang my head against the wall until I could explain it to a freshman, or a high school kid, or my father. I developed this habit. If I couldn't make it simple, I assumed I times was the one who was confused, not the student. You see, the easiest person to fool is yourself. I said that a lot because I had to keep reminding times me asterisk. It's so tempting, when you're close but not quite there, to slide over the gap and say, it's probably fine. That's how you get disasters, in science and in life. When I was on the commission investigating the Challenger accident, I saw this on a grand scale. Managers convincing themselves the O-rings were safe because the previous launches hadn't blown up yet, even though the data was screaming at them. They preferred the comforting story to the ugly reality. The fourth pattern is the opposite of that. You treat your own ideas as suspects. You interrogate them. You try to explain them in simple language, and if they squirm, you don't let them off the hook. To train that, you can do a very simple thing. Take a piece of paper and write at the top, what I times really times know about X. Then start explaining it as if to a 10-year-old. Wherever you get stuck, that's where you don't know. So those are the four patterns I saw again and again. Look at the real thing, play with it, change the picture, and be brutally honest about what you don't understand. If you watch closely, you'll see they form a loop. You start with reality, you look, you listen, you poke, then you play, you try variations, extreme cases, little experiments. Then you look for a new representation, a diagram, an analogy, a formula that makes the behavior clearer. Then you test your understanding by explaining it simply and checking for bullshit. That usually sends you right back to reality, because you notice something you missed. Around you go again. The guys people call geniuses weren't doing something from another planet. They were just running this loop faster and more deeply than everybody else, and they didn't stop when it got uncomfortable. It had nothing to do with mystical talent and everything to do with habits they'd built by being curious lunatics for years. I'll tell you something that might surprise you. When I was younger, I thought genius meant you could do enormous calculations in your head or remember whole books. Von Neumann, for example, people said he could read a page of a phone book and recite it back. That kind of thing made me feel small. I couldn't do that. I'd forget people's names 10 seconds after they told me. So for a while I figured, well, I'm just a good ordinary worker. Those guys are from a different species. What I didn't notice right away was that when we sat down with a times new times problem, something nobody had solved yet, the memory tricks didn't help very much. What mattered was who was willing to stare at the thing itself, to ask dumb questions, to fiddle around without shame. On that score I could keep up just fine, because I'd been practicing that kind of stupidity my whole life. There was a period, right after the war, when people started calling me a genius in the newspapers. It scared the hell out of me. I thought, gee, now I have to act times like a genius. So I'd sit in my office trying to think deep thoughts, capital D, capital T. Nothing came. Absolutely nothing. The more I tried to be profound, the dumber I felt. Finally I got fed up and went back to doing what I always did as a kid, doodling, mucking about with odd problems, asking why the plate wobbles. And boom, within a year I had this new approach to quantum electrodynamics. That experience convinced me of something important. Trying to times be times a genius is a great way to stop thinking like one. The pattern only works when you're honestly curious, willing to look stupid, and more interested in the problem than in how smart you seem. So let me be very concrete, because otherwise this just sounds like another nice story. Suppose you want to train your own brain to run this four-step loop the way we did. You don't need a physics lab. You just need something in the real world you can't quite explain. Pick anything. Why the shower curtain sucks in. Why the sky is blue. Why your coffee cools the way it does. Why your car's mileage changes with speed. First pattern, you promise yourself you're going to look at the times thing, asterisk, not the description. That means you watch the shower curtain, you play with the water temperature, you notice when it starts to move. Second pattern, you play. Turn the water hotter, colder, stand closer, farther, write down what happens. Third, you change the picture. Maybe you imagine air as little billiard balls being pushed around by steam. Fourth, you try to explain it simply to a kid or a friend, and you notice where you start hand-waving. If you do that with one little phenomenon after another, over months and years, your brain starts to change. It gets used to asking, what's times really times going on here, instead of what chapter is this in? You don't need fancy mathematics at first. In fact, my father did this with me when I was a boy without any equations at all. We'd go for a walk and he'd point to a bird and say, you can know the name of that bird in every language, but when you're done you'll know times nothing times about the bird. Or you can watch what it does, how it pecks, how it flies, how it behaves when other birds come around, and then you'll learn something about birds. That was pattern 1 and 2. Look at the bird. Play with questions about it. Later, when I had the math, I could build better models. But the attitude came first, from those walks with my father asking dumb questions in the woods. I used another little trick that fits into this pattern, and you can steal it. I always kept a few favorite problems in my head, questions I didn't know the answer to, but that seemed important or just annoying. Why do certain metals become superconducting? How does turbulence really work? Why do spin 1/2 particles behave so strangely? I'd carry these around for years. Whenever I learned a new piece of math or heard some new fact about nature, I'd test it against my favorite problems. Does this help? Most of the time the answer was no. But once in a while, bang, some new idea would click with an old question, and because I'd been playing with that question so long, I could spot the connection fast. That's another way genius looks from the outside. How did he see that link so quickly? From the inside, it's simple. You've been running the pattern on the same questions for a decade. This whole business isn't just for physics. It's a way of protecting yourself from nonsense in any field. At Los Alamos, I watched intelligent people do very dumb things because they believed the labels on the boxes more than the reality in front of them. Later, at NASA, I saw the same pattern in a different uniform. Charts with colored boxes saying everything was acceptable even when the raw data showed parts failing again and again. If you train your mind with these 4 patterns, you automatically start asking, acceptable times how asterisk? What are the actual numbers? What did we really see in the last test? You stop being impressed by the guy with the biggest title and start being impressed by the guy who looked at the O-ring in the freezer and actually bent it with his fingers. That kind of thinking isn't rebellious for the sake of rebellion. It's loyalty to nature over bureaucracy. Nature cannot be fooled, no matter how pretty your report looks. I don't want you to come away from this thinking, well, that's fine for Feynman and those other big shots. That's missing the whole point. The pleasure in all this is not that somebody writes your name in a textbook someday. The pleasure is in times finding things out, times tonight, tomorrow morning, every time something puzzles you. The hidden pattern in so-called genius thinking is just a disciplined way of being puzzled over and over without giving up or lying to yourself. You look at the world, you play with it, you change how you picture it, you test your understanding honestly, and then you repeat. If you do that sincerely, the universe will start to talk back. Maybe not with Nobel Prizes, maybe just with the quiet satisfaction that you really times understand why the plate wobbles or why the sky is blue. And between you and me, that feeling is already more than enough.